The depth charges had been falling like thunder from hell for the past 6 hours. Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Weber pressed his eye against the periscope, watching the dark Atlantic waters above ripple with each distant explosion. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the cold metal handles, not from fear, but from the bone-deep exhaustion that had settled into every fiber of his being. U-247 shuddered around him, her steel hull groaning under the relentless pressure of the deep waters and the punishment she had endured. "Herr Kapitän, engine room reports complete failure of the starboard diesel," came the voice of his chief engineer, Hans Miller, through the speaking tube. The man's words carried the weight of a death sentence. Without both engines, they were nothing more than a coffin drifting in the Atlantic darkness. Weber lowered the periscope and turned to survey his command. The submarine's interior, once pristine and efficient, now resembled a scene from Dante's Inferno. Emergency lighting cast eerie red shadows across the faces of his surviving crew members, 17 men out of the original 42 who had left Kiel Harbor 3 months ago. The others lay beneath canvas shrouds in the torpedo room, victims of the devastating depth charge attack that had caught them surfaced and vulnerable during what should have been a routine battery charge. The heating system wheezed and rattled, fighting a losing battle against the brutal Atlantic winter. Weber could see his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, and his men huddled together around the failing heating unit like moths drawn to a dying flame. They were burning precious fuel they could ill afford to waste, but the alternative was watching his crew slowly freeze to death in their iron tomb. Young Klaus Brenner, barely 19 and still possessing the smooth face of a boy despite months at sea, looked up from his radio station with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. "Herr Kapitän, I'm receiving American transmissions. They're coordinating search patterns directly above us." The pinging of enemy sonar echoed through the hull like the methodical hammering of a blacksmith against an anvil. Each metallic sound sent vibrations through the submarine's frame, a constant reminder that death lurked just beyond their steel walls. Weber had heard the sound countless times before, but never when his boat was this crippled, this vulnerable. "How many?" Weber asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "At least 3 destroyers, sir. Maybe more." Klaus's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, betraying the fear he was trying so hard to conceal. Weber closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of bitter reflection. He had heard rumors from other U-boat commanders during their last brief shore leave. Wild stories about American technology, about ships that could stay warm without burning coal, about weapons that could find a submarine in the darkest depths. He had dismissed such tales as enemy propaganda, designed to break German morale and spread fear among the Kriegsmarine. Now, listening to the precise coordination of the destroyers above, he wondered if those rumors might have contained more truth than he had been willing to accept. The sonar pinging grew louder, more insistent. Weber could feel the noose tightening around them. His submarine was wounded, bleeding air and oil, leaving a trail that even a novice destroyer captain could follow. The batteries were nearly dead, the air was growing thick and stale, and his men were slowly succumbing to hypothermia. "Herr Kapitän," Klaus whispered, his voice barely audible above the groaning of the hull. "Perhaps captivity would be warmer than this iron tomb." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Weber looked around at his crew, at the young faces marked by exhaustion and fear, at the veterans whose eyes held the hollow stare of men who had seen too much death. They were sailors, not martyrs. They had fought bravely, but there came a time when continued resistance served no purpose other than to ensure their own destruction. The decision, when it came, felt both inevitable and crushing. Weber moved to the speaking tube with measured steps, each footfall echoing in the confined space. "Surface the boat," he commanded, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "Prepare to surrender." The submarine's ascent felt like a resurrection from the grave. As U-247 broke the surface, Weber climbed through the conning tower hatch and was immediately struck by the bitter Atlantic wind. The cold cut through his uniform like knives, but after 30 hours in the stifling submarine, even the harsh winter air tasted like freedom. The American destroyers materialized out of the gray dawn like steel phantoms. Weber was struck by their size and the obvious quality of their construction. The lead vessel, which he could see was designated USS Fletcher, moved through the choppy waters with an almost casual confidence that spoke of technological superiority. When the American boarding party arrived, Weber was unprepared for what he saw. The sailors who climbed aboard his submarine appeared impossibly well fed and equipped. Their uniforms were clean and in perfect repair. Their equipment gleamed with the shine of superior manufacturing, and each man carried strange metal boxes that Weber had never encountered before. These were not the desperate, war-weary soldiers he had expected, but rather men who seemed untouched by the privations that had marked every German he had known for the past 2 years. The American officer, a young lieutenant with kind eyes and perfect teeth, spoke reasonable German. "Your crew will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he said with a formality that somehow managed to be both respectful and reassuring. "Please have your men gather their personal belongings." As the German prisoners were transferred to the destroyer, Weber noticed something that struck him as impossible. The American sailors working on deck wore lighter clothing despite the bitter Atlantic wind that cut through his own heavy wool coat like it was paper. Some worked with their sleeves rolled up, seemingly oblivious to the cold that had his own men shivering uncontrollably. The holding area below deck on the Fletcher defied every expectation Weber had formed during his years of naval service. The space felt mysteriously warm, enveloping the German prisoners in a comfort they had not experienced in months. Weber searched the walls and ceiling for heating pipes or the telltale signs of coal furnaces, but found nothing that could explain the pleasant temperature that surrounded them. Klaus pressed his face against a porthole, his breath no longer visible in the warm air. Through the thick glass, he watched as German sailors from other captured vessels were brought aboard, all sharing the same bewildered expressions that Weber recognized on his own men's faces. These were veteran submariners, men who understood every aspect of naval engineering, yet they found themselves in an environment that challenged everything they thought they knew about ships and the sea. The young radio man turned to his captain, his eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and confusion. The warmth of the American ship had brought color back to his pale cheeks, and for the first time in days, he was not shivering. "Herr Kapitän," Klaus whispered, his voice filled with the same bewilderment that Weber felt in his own chest. "How do they keep this ship so warm, without burning anything?" The transport truck lurched to a halt, its engine coughing into silence as Weber pressed his face against the canvas covering. Through the gap, he glimpsed towering guard towers and endless rows of barbed wire stretching across the Oklahoma plains. Camp Alva sprawled before them like a small city, its geometric precision both impressive and unsettling. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the compound, casting sharp shadows between the uniform wooden barracks that seemed to extend beyond the horizon. "Rouse! Everyone out!" barked an American guard, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. Weber's legs trembled as he climbed down from the truck bed, his muscles stiff from the long journey. Around him, his fellow prisoners moved with the cautious uncertainty of men entering unknown territory. The dust, kicked up by their boots, swirled in the dry air, coating their already grimy uniforms with another layer of grime. Colonel James Mitchell emerged from the administration building, his pressed uniform and confident stride marking him as the camp commander. Weber studied the man's face, searching for signs of the brutality he expected from an enemy officer. Instead, he found only professional composure and what appeared to be genuine concern for the arriving prisoners' welfare. The colonel's eyes swept over the group with the practiced assessment of a military leader, but there was no malice in his gaze. "Welcome to Camp Alva," Mitchell announced in accented but competent German, surprising many of the prisoners who had expected only harsh English commands. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Follow the rules, work hard, and your time here will pass without incident." His words carried weight, delivered with the kind of authority that suggested he meant every syllable. Weber found himself assigned to Barrack 7 alongside Klaus Brenner and 28 other German soldiers. As they entered the long wooden structure, Weber's engineering mind immediately began cataloging details. The building was solidly constructed with proper ventilation, real glass windows, and what appeared to be adequate insulation. Each prisoner had been assigned a metal cot with clean blankets and a small footlocker for personal belongings. The floor was swept clean, and the walls showed fresh paint that couldn't have been applied long ago. "This cannot be real," whispered Klaus, running his fingers along the smooth wooden planks of his bunk. His voice carried a mixture of wonder and suspicion that Weber shared completely. German prisoners in Russia sleep on frozen ground, if they're lucky enough to sleep at all. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, a grizzled veteran whose face bore the permanent lines of too many harsh winters on the Eastern Front, spat contemptuously into the corner. His weathered hands gestured dismissively at their surroundings as he addressed the younger prisoners with the voice of bitter experience. "Don't let this fool you," he growled, his scarred knuckles white as he gripped his footlocker. "Americans are soft, but they're not stupid. This is psychological warfare, nothing more. They want us comfortable, so we'll reveal military secrets." That evening, as Weber lay on his surprisingly comfortable mattress, he listened to the sounds of the camp settling into its nighttime routine. Guards called out positions during their regular patrols, their voices carrying clearly through the still air. Somewhere in the distance he could hear the faint sound of music drifting from what might have been the American quarters. The normalcy of it all unsettled him more than any harsh treatment might have. The next morning brought their first glimpse of the camp's most confounding mystery. Klaus had been assigned to kitchen duty, a development that filled him with nervous excitement. As Weber watched his friend disappear into the mess hall, he couldn't shake the feeling that Klaus was about to discover something significant about their captor's unusual capabilities. When Klaus returned that evening, his face was pale with bewilderment and his hands shook slightly as he tried to describe what he had witnessed. The other prisoners gathered around his bunk, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical as he struggled to find adequate words for his experience. "The American cooks," Klaus began, his voice barely above a whisper, "they use these metal devices in the kitchen. Small boxes, maybe this big." He gestured with his hands, indicating something roughly the size of a large book. "They turn a dial, and immediately there is intense heat. Enough heat to boil water, to cook meat, to warm an entire room." His eyes were wide with the fervor of someone who had witnessed something beyond his understanding. Muller's harsh laughter cut through the barracks like a blade, startling several of the younger prisoners who had been hanging on Klaus's every word. "You're talking nonsense, boy," the veteran sneered, his weathered face twisted with contempt. "There's no such thing as heat without fuel. You've been fooled by American tricks, just like they want." He turned to address the other prisoners, his voice rising with the passion of a man defending his world view. "Don't you see? They're playing games with our minds, making us believe they have superior technology. It's propaganda, nothing more." But Weber's engineering background made him less quick to dismiss Klaus's account. He had spent years studying thermodynamics and energy transfer, and while Klaus's description seemed impossible, there was something in his friend's eyes that suggested genuine bewilderment rather than deception. That night, Weber lay awake thinking about the implications of what Klaus claimed to have seen. The following Monday, Weber received his work assignment in the camp's maintenance shop, a large building filled with tools and equipment that immediately caught his professional attention. The workshop was organized with impressive efficiency, every tool in its designated place and every workbench clean and ready for use. American machinery lined the walls, their unfamiliar designs both intriguing and intimidating to Weber's trained eye. Master Sergeant Tony Ricci proved to be unlike any American soldier Weber had expected to encounter. The stocky Italian-American mechanic possessed an easy smile and spoke German with the broken grammar of someone who had learned the language through necessity rather than formal education. His hands were permanently stained with machine oil, and his uniform showed the honest wear of a man who spent his days working with his hands rather than pushing papers. "You Weber?" Ricci asked, consulting a clipboard with Weber's name written in neat block letters. "Says here you know engines, is that right?" His accent was thick, but his meaning was clear, and Weber found himself nodding despite his instinct to remain distant from his captors. "I studied mechanical engineering at the University of Munich," Weber replied carefully, uncertain how much information he should reveal. "Before the war, I worked on automotive design." Ricci's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm, as if he had discovered a kindred spirit in the most unlikely of places. "Good, good. We need someone who understands machines. Too many of these other prisoners, they know only how to march and shoot. But you and me, we speak the same language, yes?" He gestured toward a partially disassembled generator that sat on the main workbench. "This one's been giving us trouble. Maybe you take a look." For the next several hours, Weber found himself working alongside Ricci to diagnose and repair the generator's problems. Despite himself, he began to appreciate the American's expertise and collaborative approach to mechanical problem-solving. Ricci treated him as a colleague rather than an enemy, sharing tools and techniques with the casual generosity of someone who valued competence above nationality. As they worked, Weber couldn't help but notice the heating system that kept the workshop comfortable despite the October chill that had begun to settle over Oklahoma. Warm air circulated throughout the building, but he could see no visible source of heat production. No coal furnace, no wood stove, no burning fuel of any kind that he could identify. "Sergeant Ricci," Weber ventured carefully, wiping grease from his hands with a clean rag, "I am curious about your heating system. In Germany, we use coal or wood, but here I see no smoke, no fuel storage. How do you create this warmth?" Ricci's expression grew suddenly guarded, though his smile remained in place. He glanced around the workshop as if checking for eavesdroppers, then shrugged with studied casualness. "Americans, we have different ways," he said simply, his tone suggesting that further questions would not be welcome. "Different ways to do many things." That evening, Weber returned to the barracks with his mind churning with new questions and theories. The other prisoners gathered around him eagerly, hungry for any information about their captor's capabilities and intentions. He described his day in the workshop, his growing respect for American mechanical expertise, and, most importantly, his observations about their mysterious heating systems. "It's just as Klaus described," Weber told them, his voice carrying the weight of professional assessment. "Heat without visible fuel, warmth that appears from nowhere. As an engineer, I can tell you this should be impossible with any technology I understand." The prisoners spent the evening developing increasingly elaborate theories to explain what they had witnessed. Some believed the Americans had discovered a new type of coal that burned without producing smoke, perhaps a mineral unique to American soil. Others suggested that the Americans had somehow stolen advanced German technology and were using it against its creators. A few of the more imaginative prisoners wondered if the Americans had made some kind of deal with industrial manufacturers to provide them with prototype heating systems. Weber found himself writing in his secret diary that night, a small leather journal he had managed to conceal throughout his capture and transport. By the light of a small electric bulb that provided illumination without any visible power source, he recorded his observations and growing bewilderment about American capabilities. "These Americans hide their fires so well," he wrote, his pen moving carefully across the page, "that even their prisoners cannot see how they conjure warmth from nothing." He paused, considering his next words carefully before adding the thought that had been haunting him since his arrival. "Perhaps we have been captured not by soldiers but by magicians who have forgotten to tell us their tricks." The spring thunderstorm arrived without warning. its fury unleashing torrents of rain against the prison camp's wooden barracks. Lightning split the night sky in jagged white lines, and thunder rolled across the compound like artillery fire from a distant battlefield. Weber pressed his face against the cold window glass, watching the storm rage beyond the chain-link fence. The familiar ache of homesickness twisted in his chest as he remembered similar storms over the Bavarian countryside, but those memories felt like fragments from another man's life. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. Emergency lanterns cast eerie shadows across the barracks walls as prisoners stumbled in the sudden darkness. Weber heard Sergeant Ricci's voice cutting through the confusion from somewhere near the kitchen area, shouting orders in rapid English. The American sergeant's tone carried the authority of a man accustomed to solving problems quickly, and Weber found himself drawn toward the sound despite the language barrier. "Klaus! Weber!" Ricci's voice called out, surprisingly clear in the darkness. "Come help!" Weber felt his way along the rough wooden walls, Klaus beside him, both men moving carefully through the maze of overturned chairs and scattered belongings. The emergency lighting cast everything in amber shadows, transforming the familiar camp into something alien and threatening. When they reached the kitchen area, Ricci was already moving with purposeful efficiency, his silhouette solid and reassuring against the flickering light. "Power's out for the whole sector," Ricci explained, his broken German mixing with animated hand gestures. "Need to get food ready." "Evening meal, yes. Can't let men go hungry." Weber nodded, though he wondered what miracles the American expected to perform without electricity. The kitchen's massive stoves stood silent and cold, their metal surfaces already losing the day's accumulated heat. In Germany, such a situation would mean cold rations and bitter complaints, another reminder of their nation's dwindling resources and failing infrastructure. Ricci reached into a supply cabinet and withdrew something that made Weber's breath catch in his throat. The device was small enough to fit in a man's palm, constructed from gleaming aluminum that reflected the emergency lighting like a miniature mirror. Its design was elegant in its simplicity, with clean lines and precise engineering that spoke of advanced manufacturing capabilities. Weber's trained eye immediately recognized the quality of the craftsmanship, the attention to detail that marked superior industrial production. "Watch," Ricci said, his voice carrying a hint of pride as he produced a green metal canister from the same cabinet. The canister was approximately the size of a soup can, its surface painted in military olive drab with stenciled markings that Weber couldn't read in the dim light. Ricci connected the small aluminum device to the canister with a simple twisting motion, the threading precise and smooth. The mechanical click of the connection echoed in the quiet kitchen, a sound that seemed impossibly significant in the moment. Klaus leaned forward, his weathered face creased with skepticism. "What is this supposed to accomplish?" he muttered in German, his tone carrying the same dismissive edge that had characterized his attitude toward all American innovations. Weber said nothing, but his scientific mind was already racing. The device's design suggested some form of combustion system, but the scale was unlike anything he had encountered in German engineering. The miniaturization required to create such a compact unit would demand manufacturing precision that exceeded anything in his experience. Ricci adjusted something on the device's top, and Weber heard a soft hissing sound, like air escaping from a tire. Then, with a small clicking noise, blue flames erupted from the device's crown. The flames danced in perfect formation, each tongue of fire controlled and directed with mathematical precision. The heat was immediate and intense, radiating outward in waves that Weber could feel against his face from 3 feet away. Klaus stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock. "Impossible," he whispered, the word barely audible above the gentle roar of the flames. Weber stared at the device, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. The flames burned with the steady consistency of a laboratory burner, but the fuel source was clearly the pressurized gas in the canister. The technology was so advanced, so perfectly engineered, that it seemed almost magical in its simplicity. German engineers had spent years developing complex field cooking systems that required elaborate supply chains and constant maintenance. Yet here was a device that solved the same problem with elegant efficiency. Ricci placed a large metal pot on top of the device, and Weber watched in stunned silence as the water inside began to heat rapidly. Steam rose from the surface within moments, and the temperature climbed steadily toward boiling. The American sergeant smiled at their expressions, clearly enjoying their amazement. "Every soldier carries one," Ricci explained, his broken German accompanied by gestures toward his own equipment. "Independent cooking. No supply lines needed. Hot food anywhere." The implications hit Weber like a physical blow. While German troops had spent the war's final months huddled in frozen foxholes, scrounging for firewood and waiting for supply wagons that rarely came, American soldiers had been eating hot meals wherever they found themselves. The strategic advantage was overwhelming, but the psychological impact was even more devastating. Klaus had gone completely silent, his earlier mockery replaced by something approaching reverence. The veteran soldier who had ridiculed American engineering now stared at the small blue flames as if they held the secrets of the universe. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached toward the heat, then pulled back as if afraid the device might vanish. Other German prisoners began to gather around the remarkable display. Muller, the grizzled veteran who had spent weeks deriding American technological capabilities, pushed through the crowd with his characteristic bluster. But when he saw the compact stove producing enough heat to boil water, his confident smirk faded into bewildered silence. He stood there for several minutes, his mouth slightly open, struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he believed about German superiority. "How?" Weber asked in halting English, his voice hoarse with emotion. Ricci shrugged, as if such marvels were commonplace in American experience. "Gas under pressure. Simple engineering. Mass production makes them cheap. Simple engineering." The words echoed in Weber's mind like hammer blows. What Americans dismissed as basic technology represented a quantum leap beyond German capabilities. The miniaturization, the pressure systems, the metallurgy required to create such devices at scale, all of it spoke to an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything the Reich had ever achieved. The water reached a rolling boil, bubbles breaking the surface in rapid succession. Steam rose in thick clouds, carrying with it the scent of hot metal and the promise of warm food. Weber realized that this single moment had shattered more illusions than months of imprisonment and interrogation. The Nazi propaganda about German technological supremacy crumbled like paper in the face of this simple, undeniable demonstration. Klaus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "We fought with museum pieces," he said in German, his words heavy with bitter realization, "while they had the future in their pockets." Muller continued staring at the flames, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The man who had boasted about German engineering prowess now looked like someone witnessing his own obsolescence. He sat down heavily on a nearby crate, his eyes never leaving the compact stove, and began muttering under his breath about battles that might have ended differently. Weber felt the weight of revelation settling over him like a heavy blanket. Every frozen night his unit had endured, every meal of cold rations, every soldier lost to the misery of inadequate equipment, all of it could have been prevented if German engineering had achieved what Americans considered routine. The scope of their technological disadvantage was staggering, reaching far beyond weapons and into the fundamental tools of survival. As the evening wore on and Ricci prepared the meal using his miraculous device, Weber found himself calculating the broader implications. How many German lives might have been saved with such equipment? How many battles might have turned out differently if their soldiers had possessed the means to maintain morale and health in harsh conditions? The questions multiplied in his mind, each one adding to the crushing weight of understanding. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the kitchen, the small blue flames burned steadily, a beacon of technological achievement that illuminated the vast chasm between American capability and German pretension. Weber knew that this moment would haunt him forever. This simple demonstration of superiority that made mockery of everything he had been taught to believe. That night, as he sat in his bunk listening to the rain against the windows, Weber understood with crystalline clarity why the war had been lost. The revelation was as devastating as it was complete, stripping away the last vestiges of his faith in German supremacy and leaving him face to face with an uncomfortable truth that would reshape his understanding of the world forever. We have been fighting the future with tools from the past and never knew why we were losing. The winter wind whistled through the barbed wire of Camp Alva as Weber clutched the crumpled letter in his trembling hands. 6 months had passed since Germany's inevitable collapse, and the words from his brother Ernst cut through him like shattered glass. The paper, smuggled through a network of sympathetic guards and prisoners, bore the desperate scrawl of a man witnessing his nation's final gasps. "Heinrich," the letter began, "you cannot imagine what we face here on the Eastern Front. Our soldiers burn furniture torn from abandoned houses, books stolen from libraries, anything that will catch flame just to heat our meager rations. The cold claims more of our men than Russian bullets ever could." Weber's eyes drifted from the letter to the small aluminum device sitting on the wooden table before him, the American portable stove that Sergeant Ricci had permitted him to examine. The contrast struck him with devastating clarity. While German soldiers froze and starved, reduced to burning literature for warmth, American forces carried these simple yet ingenious devices that transformed warfare itself. The stove represented something far more profound than mere military equipment. It embodied a fundamental philosophical difference in how the two nations approached conflict. Germans, Weber realized with growing unease, had poured their resources into creating massive, complex weapons. The colossal tanks, the experimental rockets, the elaborate fortifications that had ultimately proven as fragile as morning frost. Americans, meanwhile, had perfected countless small innovations, each one designed with a singular purpose: keeping their soldiers alive, fed, and capable of fighting another day. Klaus approached the table, his footsteps echoing across the concrete floor of the workshop where German prisoners worked alongside their American captors. The young soldier's English had transformed remarkably over the months, polished through daily interactions with American mechanics who treated him more as a curious apprentice than a defeated enemy. "Weber," Klaus said, his accent still thick but his grammar increasingly precise, "I have learned something that will astonish you. These stoves, they are manufactured by the millions in factories across America." Weber looked up from his brother's letter, eyebrows raised in disbelief. "Millions? That cannot be possible." "It is true," Klaus continued, settling onto the bench beside his fellow prisoner. "But here is what truly amazes me. These factories were not built for war. They previously manufactured camping equipment for American families who ventured into their wilderness for pleasure. When war came, they simply adapted their machinery." The revelation stunned Weber into silence. In Germany, military production required massive state enterprises, enormous bureaucracies, and years of planning. The concept that civilian camping equipment manufacturers could seamlessly transform into military suppliers challenged everything he understood about industrial warfare. "How can this be?" Weber muttered, turning the lightweight stove over in his hands. "Such efficiency, such adaptability. It defies everything we were taught about American industrial capacity." Klaus leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper despite the relative privacy of their workspace. "The mechanics tell me that American industry operates differently than ours. Instead of central planning from Berlin, thousands of independent companies compete and innovate. When war arrived, they simply redirected their existing expertise toward military needs. As the months passed and repatriation preparations began, Weber found himself facing an impossible decision. The other German prisoners spoke constantly of returning home, of rebuilding the fatherland, of reclaiming their honor from the ashes of defeat. But Weber had seen something in that simple aluminum stove that his comrades refused to acknowledge: the future of warfare itself. The decision crystallized one evening as Weber sat alone in the camp library, surrounded by American technical manuals that Ricci had allowed him to study. The pages detailed manufacturing processes, quality control methods, and industrial strategies that had enabled America to produce not just superior weapons, but superior logistics, superior support systems, superior care for their fighting men. When Weber announced his intention to remain in America and seek employment with the company that manufactured the portable stoves, the reaction among his fellow prisoners was swift and merciless. "Traitor!" shouted Lieutenant Hoffman, his face flushed with rage. "You would abandon the fatherland in her darkest hour? You betray everything we fought for," added Corporal Schneider, his voice thick with disgust. "Have you no honor, no loyalty to Germany?" The accusations cut deeply, but Weber stood firm in his conviction. "I have seen the future of industrial warfare," he replied quietly, meeting each accusing stare with steady resolve. "Germany will need decades to rebuild not just her factories, but her entire approach to technology. Someone must learn these American methods." Only Muller, the quiet soldier still haunted by memories of frozen comrades who had never returned from the Eastern Front, understood Weber's reasoning. During their final conversation before the repatriation ship's arrival, Muller placed a supportive hand on Weber's shoulder. "You are not betraying Germany," Muller said softly, his eyes distant with remembered horror. "You are trying to ensure that future German soldiers will never again die needlessly in the cold while their enemies stay warm and fed." The revelation that would reshape Weber's understanding came from an unexpected source. On the morning of departure, as German prisoners lined up with their meager possessions for the journey home, Sergeant Ricci approached Weber with a knowing smile. "Before you make your final decision," Ricci said, "there's something you should know about that stove you've been studying so intently." Weber looked up expectantly, the aluminum device still cradled in his hands like a talisman. "The original inventor was a German-American engineer named Friedrich Brenner," Ricci continued. "His parents immigrated to America to escape the previous war. The technology that has so impressed you and your fellow prisoners is actually German ingenuity, adapted and refined by American industrial efficiency." The irony was not lost on Weber. The device that had revolutionized his understanding of warfare was itself a product of German innovation, transformed by American systems into something far more effective than its creators had ever imagined. As the repatriation ship prepared to depart, Weber stood at the dock watching his former comrades board with mixed emotions. Some refused to meet his eyes, still viewing his decision as treachery. Others, like Muller, offered quiet nods of understanding and respect. Weber held the small aluminum stove in his hands, feeling its modest weight and simple construction. Yet he knew it represented something far more significant than a mere cooking device. It was proof that wars were won not by the strongest soldiers or the most fearsome weapons, but by the nations that best cared for their fighting men in 1,000 small, seemingly insignificant ways. The ship's horn echoed across the harbor as the vessel began its journey toward a Germany that existed now only in memory. Weber remained on the dock, watching until the ship disappeared beyond the horizon, carrying with it his past and leaving him to build a future from the lessons learned in captivity. The real war was not between our weapons, but between our willingness to keep our men human. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of innovation, technological progress, and the awe of discovery during wartime. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire appreciation for human ingenuity and the transformative power of science.